Drive, 9 p.m. After completing their business at Gringotts, Harry, Hester and Artie celebrated with a nice meal at Summerisles before driving out to Surrey. They arrived at 4 Privet Drive just after 9 o'clock. Artie knocked sharply on the door, which was opened by what appeared to be an anthropomorphic pig wearing baggy sweatpants and an ill-fitting Smeltings t-shirt. Dudley Dursley looked at the three for a long while before yelling over his shoulder, "Mom, Dad, the freakess back. And he's GOT too, other freaks with HIM."
Charming,
muttered Artie.
"Oh, you have no idea,"
replied Harry as he pushed his way past Dudley and led the other two into the house.
"Good evening, Aunt Petunia, Uncle Vernon. I'd like to introduce some people to you. These are my solicitors, Artemis Podmore and Hester Jones. They have some legal matters they'd like to discuss with you."
what's the meaning of this?
Blustered Vernon.
Are they freaks like you, boy?
Harry looked at his uncle with obvious disgust. "Yes, Uncle Vernon, they're both freaks like me, except that these freaks are fully grown wizards who know a lot more magic than me and who have the legal right to use it. So I wouldn't use that word again because you might end up on all fours squealing like a pig." Vernon paled, while Dudley whimpered in fear. Apparently, at some point over the last year, Vernon and Petunia had explained to their son what sorts of things an angry wizard could do to a muggle who had drawn his wrath. Minutes later, after sending Dudley upstairs, Vernon and Petunia sat down across the kitchen table from the three wizards as Hester and Artie explained.
"How it's going to be."
Harry's room was Harry's room. They would be making some modifications to it for security purposes, but nothing that should have any impact on the Dursleys. Muggles would be in over the next week to install separate phone and cable TV lines for the boys' room, which he would pay for himself. He would also get a mini fridge, a hot plate and a microwave, and be responsible for his own meals. After that, a door would be put into the exterior wall of Harry's room with magic, along with a set of stairs leading down to the backyard so that he could come and go without disturbing them. These would be concealed from Muggle eyes by magic and removed when Harry eventually moved out. In the meantime, the Dursleys wouldn't even know he was there, except for when he came out of his room to take a shower or use the toilet. Starting in July, he would be gone every Saturday for tutoring with a wand-certified instructor and also be gone every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon for tutoring in other courses, which included occlumency, financial management, and even flying lessons, though the wizards didn't bother to share those irrelevant details. He had tentative plans to leave and visit friends over the summer, and as a courtesy, he would notify the Dursleys when he'd be gone for any extended time. Most importantly, Harry would do no chores and be subject to no discipline from Vernon, let alone bullying from Dudley and his friends. On this issue, Hester abandoned any pretense of deference to the Dursleys' feelings. While wizards had no monarchy, they did have an aristocracy of sorts, and Harry was a son of it. And if he were deliberately harmed while in the Dursleys' care, and it were reported to the right ministry officials, there would be no official sanction. Because those officials wouldn't waste the effort of legal due process on muggles who assaulted wizards of Harry's status. Instead, some people would probably just come for them in the night, and by the time the sun rose, none of their friends, neighbors, or co-workers would even remember that anyone named Dursley had ever lived at 4 Privet Drive. With that, Harry led the two solicitors up to his room, where they made a few technical notes about the changes to his room. Then they produced a bill for him to sign in order to pay for the modifications as well as for their legal work to date. Harry was happy to pay thanks to Hester and Artie. He now had a second and rather sizable trust vault, one which he could access relatively freely and about which James Potter knew nothing. The two solicitors left, and Harry unpacked his trunk and placed Hedwig's cage on the hook next to the window. Then he plopped down onto his bed and sighed happily. It was going to be a great summer. Downstairs, as Hester was leaving, she made eye contact with Vernon and Petunia and shuddered. The look they were giving her was unsettling. She decided that tomorrow she'd talk with Artie about whether any additional security measures were needed. As the witch closed the door behind her, Petunia threw herself into Vernon's arms and started weeping.
SHH, pet.
Said Vernon soothingly, "It'll be all right. But they were in our house, Vernon, and the things they said, us just disappearing in the night like that, Vernon held his wife close and rubbed her back soothingly.
They said that he'll keep the freakishness away from us, that we'll hardly know the boy is here. That's got to be an improvement, right?
But what if he doesn't? What if the boy gets worse?
She whispered, her voice trembling. Vernon turned and looked up, as if he could peer through the ceiling to the boy's room and see him sitting there, mocking them both, leering at them with his wicked green eyes. Vernon's mouth twitched nervously.
If it gets worse.
Vernon repeated in a low, mean voice, one that promised to protect his family from their unwanted and unnatural intruder, no matter what the cost. Well then, the freak will have to sleep sometime, won't he? Potter Manor, 3 a.m. James stared at the ceiling of the darkened bedroom for hours until he could stand it no longer. Carefully, he got out of bed without waking Lily and made his way down the hall to his private office. Once inside, he locked the door with his strongest privacy spell and poured himself another glass of scotch. There was a part of him that knew perfectly well that alcohol never solved anything. There was another part, however, that believed that alcohol was as good a response as any when there were no solutions to be had. He sat there for quite a while, sipping his scotch and staring out the window as the full moon shone down upon him. Idly he wondered where Remus was and whether he was happy or safe or even alive. It had been a long 10 years after all. Shaking off the memory of his former friend, he rose and walked over to the cold fireplace where the Potter coat of arms stood above the mantel. Placing his hand on it, he recited his family's motto.
Vigilamus pro te.
The ancient motto tasted bitter in his mouth. We stand on guard for thee was the English translation, but it rather seemed that he'd failed on that regard, having fallen asleep at his post in the worst possible way. He felt a soft vibration in his hand, and then the coat of arms slid aside to reveal a compartment that would not have existed in the material world had anyone not of Potter blood tried to open it. Inside were various legal papers, about 10,000 galleons in an expanding bag, his late father's wand, and a glass orb which he picked up and carried over to his father's desk. To James, it would never truly be his desk. It would always belong to Charles Potter. Still holding a glass of scotch in one hand, James sat and tapped the orb with his wand. The phantasmal form of a woman appeared over it, the seeress Trelawney reciting that wretched prophecy he'd heard so many times before. How he hated the name Trelawney. As James listened to the woman's voice, he thought back over his life, or more accurately, over Harry's life, and the mistakes he'd made that had brought him and his family and his world to this point. He remembered holding little Harry in his arms and weeping uncontrollably when Dumbledore and the doctors said he would be a squib, and that it might possibly have been something Jim did to defeat Voldemort that made him a squib. That was his first mistake. He should have demanded to keep Harry in the family, no matter what the cost. Lily was right. It might have broken Harry to be a squib raised in the Potter house alongside with the boy who maybe stole his magic. Possibly, it might have even killed the boy if some future attack caused Jim to drain Harry's very life away once he had no more magic to give. But James would have raised Harry right, and his heir would have hated the Slytherins the way a Potter should have. He remembered the elation he felt when he learned that Harry was a wizard after all, followed by the horror of realizing how the Dursleys had treated him, and then the heartbreak of Harry telling him to his face that he wished that James had been a muggle drug addict dead of a car crash. That was his second mistake. He should have snatched Harry away from the Dursleys that day, taken him home and begged and pleaded for forgiveness. If nothing else, he'd have had a month to persuade Harry to fear and distrust the Slytherins, the way a Potter should have. He remembered receiving the news from Jim about Harry's sorting and then getting blind stinking drunk. And far, far worse, sending the boy a howler while blind stinking drunk. He didn't even fully appreciate what he'd done until Lily's own howler screamed at him while he was at the Aura's office, still recovering from his hangover. He remembered the twisting knots in his stomach as he recalled the awful things he'd said, remembered how he'd completely annihilated any possibility of bringing Harry back into the family, remembered how he'd ruined everything. All of those things passed through his mind as he downed his scotch and listened to the final closing lines of the Trelawney prophecy, the first Trelawney prophecy. Not the one made in 1980 by that drunken fraud Sybil Trelawney, which heralded Jim Potter as the defeater of Voldemort. No, this was the much earlier prophecy made by the celebrated Lady Cassandra Trelawney to Lord Nathaniel Potter in 1780, the prophecy that had guided the Potter family for 10 generations as a sacred family trust. The prophecy that now was nothing but a cruel testament to James's failures as a wizard, as a father, and as the lord of his house. And you shall know by these portents that the time of the dark god approaches and the destruction of our world is close at hand, when the two who should be as one are set against each other in reckless hate, and the last Potter rises as the Prince of Slytherin, to be continued in
Harry Potter and the Secret Enemy.